And we're back for episode 26 of Pursuing the Perfect Pint podcast. And this week, much like the RMI, we're going to be hearing about industry collaboration across the US malt supply chain. But before we get into that, Brent, the market update for the week. I think you were in the UK last week.
Yeah, so I guess, but at this time of year, I always like to get out and experience or see some of the crops. So spent a few days in the UK last week. Very, very hot, but
Yes.
even by UK standards for sure, but even by normal standards. So it was interesting, Danielle, to go around and see some of the barley crop. It is definitely a building concern around dryness. There was some barley that looked pretty ordinary, desperately in need of some moisture, and that was pretty common. Generally, there's some really good looking barley as well, but the common theme was moisture is needed. I guess the point this week is there's a lot of rain in the forecast, so we're kind of at this pivotal point, which we always reach as we get into approaching or into June, and there is some widespread rain across Europe. So if that rain materializes, I think we would see the whole supply chain become much more comfortable, that we're going to have a pretty reasonable outcome. But we have to watch the weather maps, as I do daily at this time of year. But we're really in this really the next 2 weeks will have an immense impact on the final outcome of the crop.
And does that say applying the Western Europe, France, etc., in terms of the needing a bit of rain?
Yeah, I would say so. Dry pockets here and there, but even with that, what we're seeing, and we'll hear it, and it's mentioned quite a bit in the discussion with Ashley that we're going to share. But we see a lot of resiliency in barley production. A lot of that comes from the varieties that we have in place now, and they're able to withstand a lot more of this crop stress. Right now, it's hot, dry weather across Western Europe. Interestingly, in Russia, it's the complete opposite. It's so wet they have trouble even planting. So I guess it's a reminder for climate change. It's not just drought all the time. It's the variability. You can go from drought to very wet conditions, and what you don't want is drought on barley and then heavy rain at harvest. That would be a dire outcome, and that's mentioned a little bit as we get into the next one. So that's the market. I think wait and see on the weather as we do. The other thing I did, because I have free time, I was going through the financial reports for all the major brewers and distillers, and I thought, like Diageo, for example, their Guinness brand last year was up nearly 4%, and their overall beer portfolio was up 6%. That was massively outperforming the industry. So there's little tidbits of information like that give us some optimism that maybe beer volumes are gradually turning around. And it's somewhat similar in whiskey, not quite as good. Canadian whiskey, for Diageo as an example, was up 5% last year. Indian produced whiskey was up 7%. So those are very, very good stories.
Yeah.
The big one, Scotch whiskey, was down 2%. So that reminds us that whole issue, maybe tariffs are part of that. So there are some little green shoots of positivity coming out. I've wrote that in the journal for this week. So really, my job is as a cheerleader. I try to give people a bit of optimism when I can see it. As a convicted optimist, I try to do my job, and there's lots of that coming. But that's really what's happening. I think that's most important at the moment.
I think even still slightly more optimistic even than we were in March this year. So there's definitely some green shoots, it would appear.
Yeah, for sure. Which I think we need after 3 years of downturn.
Definitely. And up next, Brent, is to hear from Ashley, who is the AMBA president and CEO, and a really interesting conversation about how they have, I think, outperformed in terms of funding that they've received and how they've gone about that.
Yeah, really good story on collaboration, but let's hear it from Ashley herself. Okay, well, the Pursuing the Perfect Pint podcast is making a journey over to the U.S., so we're pleased to have Ashley McFarland with us from AMBA, and we will explain all what AMBA is in a second. But Ashley, first of all, thanks for taking some time to catch up, and maybe we could start with a a bit of an introduction of who Ashley is and what keeps you busy on your day-to-day work.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for having me here today. Ashley McFarland. I am now the president of the American Malting Barley Association. And as this podcast is the pursuit of the perfect pint, our association is all about the pursuit of the perfect barley. So our organization really focuses on barley improvement. And this role I actually just took on January 1 after serving as the vice president for about 4 years. But of note is that this leadership transition happened because longtime AMBA employee Scott Heisel just retired in April. And prior to him was Mike Davis. So those two individuals actually ran this association collectively for almost 40 years. So although I have only got a few years in the job, there's really only been a handful of employees at AMBA since the early 80s. So it's been a very interesting transition, a big switch over from what AMBA was prior, but really excited to take this job on. Prior to coming to AMBA, I've actually primarily worked in academia and in research. So I work in the cooperative extension system across multiple universities in the United States. I actually am a farm girl from Iowa originally and really had a passion for agriculture and specifically working with farmers to make farming easier, more profitable. And a lot of that work I did through the lens of conservation. So how can we protect our soil and water resources so that we can be good stewards of the land? So that kind of passion took me work across the states of Iowa, Idaho, Michigan, and now ultimately I'm living in northern Minnesota. My husband actually works for the U.S. Forest Service, so that's why we've moved around so much. So often I've been living in the trees maybe and not in the barley fields, but along the way I've actually picked up a lot of experience working in agriculture. And prior to coming to Minnesota was actually at Michigan State University, where I was the director of a research center there in the far northern reaches of Michigan on Lake Superior. And specifically, we were looking at how to diversify agriculture up there, make farmers more profitable. And at the time, the craft beer boom was huge, and especially in Michigan, breweries were opening every week. And people in Michigan also really love Michigan grown products. Outside of California, Michigan is the most diverse agricultural state in the US. And so I was thinking, well, if we want to diversify agriculture, craft beer is huge. Let's bring barley into the rotation and figure out how we can get more Michigan barley in Michigan beer. So that was really kind of how I got started. Ironically, became a funded researcher of AMBA back then and was receiving funds through the association I now work for. When I moved to Minnesota, this job the vice president job had opened up, and folks at AMBA had reached back out to me just based on knowing me from previous time in Michigan. Yeah, so here I am now. Rest is history, I guess. And really proud to be leading the organization now. We are a bit leaner, so we've downsized staff a little bit to right size really to industry kind of demands, but really excited to take the association on a new path and hopefully can really be good stewards of our members' resources and serve them all.
Yeah, and some big shoes to fill with Mike and Scott, but I know you're up for it, and I've had lots of interactions with them over the years. So yeah, really good to see you step in and carry the baton forward for them as well. So from a American Malting Barley Association, I guess maybe explain a little bit what are the kind of two or three key functions or things that you focus upon for your clients, and maybe who those clients are.
Yeah, that's great. So, AMBA really has a pretty niche window of work that they are involved in. So everything we're doing is to make sure that our members, which are maltsters, brewers, and distillers, have the barley they need to make their product. And so whether it's shifting consumer preference, whether it's changing climatic conditions, or perhaps even stressors just in the agricultural industry, we need to constantly be improving our barley varieties. And the ways we do that is, first of all, about half of our membership dues actually gets routed through a research grant program that we support. We are actively supporting virtually every barley breeding program in the US, along with some additional research that helps us better understand not only barley development, but also barley improvement. And so that is really kind of a cornerstone to our association is that grant program. But then we do other work. So we actually have something called the quality evaluation program. So kind of the results of those funding investments is taking the new barley lines that breeders are developing and running them through a pretty intensive vetting process to make sure that that variety is actually going to be successful in the industry. So we actually have a core group of members within our association that reviews all of that data and then makes those recommendations so that we know what barley lines we want to advance. And then another item that we do is lobbying. And this is a pretty actually intensive part of the job. Maybe doesn't get to be seen as much, but even though we do have a research grant program, we're investing money into those research programs at the various land grant universities, but it's definitely not enough money. As we like to say, is primarily a public sector crop. So there's not a lot of private investment in barley improvement. So if we're not doing it, probably nobody is. And so I actively lobby on Capitol Hill requesting Congress to make additional investments in barley research and improvement. And so we actually have been quite successful. So on top of our research grant program, on average, every year, we're also convincing Congress to invest between 6 to 7 million additional dollars just in barley research in the US. So that provides a wonderful multiplier effect. And it's actually the reason a lot of our members are members of AMBA is because they understand the importance of doing that advocacy work for barley. Along with that, we also do crop reporting, and we also will do a lot of educational events just for our members. But really, again, everything we're doing is to focus on that barley improvement piece. And so we have a couple different buckets of work to get there, but that's really our focus.
So you're focusing all the way back through to the farmer and the varieties that are being planted by those farmers for brewers of all sizes as well, right? So I guess maybe the lobby effort is a little bit more unique in the US because that funding is something I'm not going to say negotiated. There's a lot of pressure. It's not easy to get budgetary support, and when there's cost-cutting measures and all these things, I guess a disproportionate amount of your time must be focused on how you tell that story to people in Washington and how you can keep that funding behind malting barley. Certainly for the malt supply chain, it's critically important. Is there a lot of education related to that in terms of educating people on the importance of barley?
Absolutely. And of course, we're known on the Hill for the slogan, no barley, no beer. Which also we have to make sure we're saying no barley, no bourbon too, because that has become a pretty big part of our portfolio. But for sure, a lot of that is storytelling and specifically connecting the supply chain pieces. So in my role, which we actually have essentially kind of an offshoot organization called the National Barley Improvement Committee. And that is the organization that does the advocacy work. And I serve as the executive secretary for that. My job is to make sure that I'm bringing the right people on the Hill to tell those stories. Benefactor of receiving those funds and able to do the work. We bring a farmer in the room so that the farmer can talk about why it's important the research is happening. One of the best illustrations is when farmers talk about the fusarium head blight or head scab epidemic that really took out small grains, especially in the 90s in the Minnesota and North Dakota regions. And I mean, I have farmers tell stories about how they thought they were never going to be able to grow small grains again, but because of the federal investments in research, they're able to, and they're able to supply, the local malt houses and whatnot with barley. And then we also bring industry members in. And it's unique because, AMBA, Mike Davis always said this, big and small, we represent them all. And that is true. So we, in every area of the industry, whether it's maltsters, brewers, or distillers, we have people in our portfolio that we serve that are the smallest and also the biggest in the US. And although perhaps their day-to-day kind of challenges might look a little different, at the heart of the work, it's all the same. And I think our association really brings those diverse interests together, and we're able to work together really well. And so when we're telling those stories, it's great to have all sizes represented, because the other thing that's really important, if you've ever been involved in advocacy or lobbying work, is if you want to be able to get in the door somewhere, specifically with a congressperson that you want to influence, it's best to bring a constituent with you, so somebody from that state. And so if we only focused on the largest companies, perhaps that are, in just select areas throughout the US, we wouldn't have as great of representation. Or even if we just only focused on states that grew barley, because that's a pretty small footprint. So when we start bringing our craft maltsters, brewers, and distillers into DC, all of a sudden that opens the door, because every state has a craft brewery, and people can really resonate with why that's important to the local economy. Talk about the huge multiplier effect on the craft beer industry, actually beer industry as a whole. For every dollar invested there, there's a $400 economic return. Likewise, when we talk about agricultural research, we've been able to prove that every dollar invested in ag research has a $25 return. So that $6 or $7 million that the federal government's investing in barley research, there is a huge multiplier on that. And so again, that really is a big piece of that storytelling, is supporting the research at their local university, making sure that farmers near them can stay profitable, and also making sure then that brewery or distillery can stay open because of the investments they're making.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned it a couple of times, like storytelling is so important. It's one of the reasons why we do the podcast, of course. And I think you added a little bit to it. I always think the farmer story is an important one, but it's also probably one of the most effective ones. And I think that's a little bit what you were talking about. Like, take a farmer and rather than speak on behalf of the farmer, let the farmer speak, because that always comes across as extremely authentic, and they just say it the way it is. And I think it's quite powerful to say it that way. And I guess as you described that, I think the maybe more so from a craft brewing perspective, you're kind of at a grassroots kind of level. And I think that is also very authentic, and that story itself is quite powerful. We try to connect with as many of these brewers because they all have amazing stories, and they all like to talk about it, just like farmers. So you've got people willing to talk about all the things they're currently doing, what more they're willing to do, and I guess getting those in front of those decision makers in Washington can only help, I guess, in a way, keep the momentum behind this so it's in a good place. And we talked the decade ahead or the next 20 years. You would hope that continued development of new varieties that adapt to climate change and some of the disease things you mentioned, I guess, do you feel pretty good about the state of those efforts and how it's positioned? Do you feel pretty optimistic about the funding and the support over the next 10 years, or is it an annual challenge?
It is definitely a ongoing challenge. However, I think Barley has been very fortunate, and I do believe it's because of our approach and how we act in DC and the work that we do to really build that support. We have been receiving incremental increases to our federal research budget over the past several years, despite several crops and programs getting cut. So I think that our storytelling is working. I think bringing farmers to the hill really does get the job done. And so I think we've been successful. What I'm really excited about is we have several research initiatives that we focus on. I already mentioned one with Fusarium head blight. The U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative is a huge driver of research and a large investment by the federal government to do that work. But one that we actually just started a few years ago, and this was actually in response to the devastating drought that we experienced here in the U.S. in 2021. So that drought definitely substantially lowered our production volumes, primarily because of the drought. But then on top of that, we had huge quality concerns because we had these kind of random, like untimely rains right at harvest that caused a lot of pre-harvest sprout. So just generally, our volume of barley was down 30% in 2021, which was devastating because a lot of our companies had to import barley. And probably great for some of your listeners that got to send some barley to the U.S., but AMBA exists because we want everyone to be able to get their barley here domestically in the U.S. And so we really had to have a kind of a hard talk of like, okay, we do not have very resilient barley. That barley either shriveled up or sprouted. What are we going to do to change that? And so we developed what's now called the Resilient Barley Initiative, which is a brand new initiative focusing on things like drought stress and kind of more of that heat tolerance. Also looking at balancing that sprout and dormancy issue. Obviously, we don't want barley to be dormant forever, but we also need to make sure that it can get rained on in the field. And so we're working on things like that. And then the other piece that I think is quite interesting for the US and definitely has had slower adoption is a lot of our companies and even farmers are looking more towards winter barley as being a much better option in the rotation, especially if we're going to see continuing warming in climates or maybe some of these erratic weather patterns, which is what we're primarily seeing in the northern latitudes. And so if we can make barley more resilient to those weather pressures, perhaps improve our winter barley germplasm and get more winter barley varieties out there, it's going to make our industry as a whole more resilient, more sustainable. farmers will be more profitable. So that's where we're really shifting a lot of our focus right now. And that's what I'm really excited about because this resonates on the Hill. Granted, in half of the offices we're in, they don't want us to talk about climate change. That's fine. But we can still talk about drought and we can talk about rain and we can talk about things that really do impact the farmer's bottom line. And those are the stories that a lot of the folks on the Hill want to hear about. We actually just last year received the first $1 million brand new money to work on the Resilient Barley Initiative. Those monies are just now starting to get delivered to our various research stations and so that work will start. But we were in DC just in March, and actually the House has already said that they would like to increase the funding on that for this next year. So I stay optimistic because people realize what we're doing is very targeted. We are developing these priorities based on the needs of both industry and the agricultural community. And so I think they see the hard work we're doing to make sure that we're efficiently utilizing those resources. So we have to fight tooth and nail every year for it, but we've been successful and hopefully we'll continue to be so.
Yeah, well, it's amazing that you think the success in doing that, as you mentioned earlier, like barley is a niche crop. It's a niche crop globally. Certainly, it's a niche crop agriculturally in the U.S. So to go up against the big where you come from, Iowa, big corn state, and
Yeah.
corn producers and soybean producers are also lobbying at the same time. So it's not like you're the only game in town either when you go there. So to hear those successes would indicate you're doing something right in your approach, and that storytelling piece that we talked about is good. A related topic, which is probably a good one to build off that, just around the world, everyone's working on sustainability for sure, and regen agriculture and all these things. Maybe that's a bit like the people in Washington don't want to talk about climate change, but you can't ignore it. I just wondered, as you look forward in what you're doing, I guess increasingly there'll be more and more discussion about sustainability and more about regen ag and so on. How, maybe in general, how are you looking at that from an AMBA perspective, and how does it change a little bit your thinking of what you'll be doing 3 to 5 years from now?
Yeah, good question. So, when I came into AMBA, I truly felt I got the job because I had worked in the conservation regen ag space for so long throughout my career. And so I was really bringing that to the table as something that I could help the association with because they were certainly before my time realizing that this was something that they wanted to tackle in this kind of pre-competitive space. And so I had some ideas on how we could do that. And so a couple years into my role as VP, I developed and we formed what's called the Sustainability Committee for AMBA. Folks that are, we represent kind of self-select who wants to be involved in those efforts. But we had a lot of dialogue around like, well, what matters to you as a company in this space? Like, what are the things that you're having a hard time doing yourself that maybe collaboratively we could do better together? One of the things was around metrics and just trying to baseline or really measure the environmental impact of growing barley. A lot of companies were starting to come under higher pressure to report on their scope 3 emissions and really just understand all the emissions resulting from their supply chain. And so that's really what then gave birth to this idea of doing what we call the Baselining Barley Project, which allowed us to actually calculate baseline emissions for barley produced in the US. What might be surprising for a lot of folks is these numbers literally did not exist before we did this work. So there are platforms and programs that are out there that claim to represent barley, but if you start digging behind the curtain there, you're going to see that a lot of the data that's in those models is based on wheat or barley in other countries. It's not actually based on US production. And I think that was one reason we could really get the farmers to rally around that project is they wanted to be better represented because they felt like the numbers, the dialogue, the narrative, the story was not their own. It was someone else was telling it for them. And so that's when we brought together our industry members, really identified kind of what were those metrics that we wanted to understand, and then bring the farmers along, obviously, because we needed them to provide their data so that we could make those calculations. Now, this was a very hard project to deliver on.
Yeah. Very complex topic too. Like it's very complex, and you could get lost very quickly in that whole subject.
Absolutely, absolutely. And already farmers are, I don't want to say cynical, but farmers have been tossed around a lot in this whole data conversation, right? Like everybody wants their information, they want to know what's going on in the field. It takes time to collect that information and data and to report it. So like who's paying for this? So there's this ongoing conversation about that, which made this even more challenging. But at the end of the day, what I wanted to remind the farmers is like if we we don't set our narrative, someone's going to set it for us. They already have. And so I actually believe strongly, based on some just kind of anecdotal survey work that I did before we dove into this project, is really identified, okay, like how many of our farmers are already using no-till practices? How many of our farmers have diverse crop rotations? Like all these regenerative agriculture strategies, already the barley industry in the US was predominantly doing this, upwards of 70 to 80%, depending on the practice that you were looking at. So that's when I tossed it back to them. Like, we're already doing really good work. Let's prove that. And without the numbers, we can't prove it. And so the baselining barley project really allowed us to set that baseline, identify what our emissions are off production, talk about the wonderful work we're already doing with conservation or no-till, the diverse crop rotations that our barley is in, and also some of the cover crop usage that's already happening in some of the regions. At the end of the day, barley is a far more sustainable crop than almost any other crop in the rotation. That's why farmers grow it. And so I just want farmers to be reminded that this is why we do this, is to be able to tell that story and to make sure that folks understand that barley farmers are already doing a really good job. And now our industry members can tell a story around that. One other thing we're doing within sustainability that I think is noteworthy and is probably going to move the needle more than anything else is that when we look at barley production, about 70% of those emissions is tied up just in the fact that we use nitrogen fertilizer. So that is a huge contributor of emissions to our overall budget. And that is where we're going to affect change if we ever want to make improvements. And so we are also part of the sustainability committee was commissioning a pretty expansive research project across the states of Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, looking at some of these alternative nitrogen sources that might be able to allow us to lower some of our emissions. So that's just another thing. Like the baselining barley project was huge, but now that we've identified where are some of the areas for improvement, this research around nitrogen, I think, is really going to feed into that well so that some
Yeah,
of those farmers that want to lower their emissions have some options and opportunities to do so.
yeah, that's really interesting. It's kind of a similar story elsewhere in the world, but it's good. I'm not sure everyone else has got to that same point yet where the baseline, as you said, a lot of people, a lot of farmers have been doing a lot of this for many years and it's only now kind of getting to an actionable point where people are needing the baseline because they actually want to start recording it. Maybe it's driven by some of the larger companies have made targets on carbon reduction and so on. So maybe it just is it's just a natural step in the maturation of this, but it seems like it's getting lots of traction. Good to hear that the baseline, you have to measure anything, you have to have a baseline,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's the key thing. But maybe on that one, Ashley, we'll have to maybe have a separate episode on that because
Yeah.
we could. I think it's great work and there's lots going on. Maybe to wrap up, we could talk. You mentioned it earlier. We call it the Pursuing the Perfect Pint podcast, and we at this point usually ask people what does the perfect pint look like. I can anticipate maybe part of your response would be you have to have perfect barley to make the perfect pint. So you're already well down the path of it. I hadn't thought of it in those terms really, but yeah, you can't. It's maybe that you can't overstep the importance of the barley. So if you were thinking of someone that was going to enjoy the perfect pint, what would it look like from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I always am keeping that supply chain at heart and all of that. And so, that perfect pint would be representing, a strong agricultural economy that was able to produce the barley and the hops and other ingredients that were in part, but also a malting industry that was able to bring that barley in at a good price, but still was able to give a good price to the farmer, be able to produce that malt that then fit the needs of the industry end user, whether they were putting it in a pint of beer or a barrel of bourbon. I think it's really important to make sure that we're thinking about that whole supply chain because all the time, especially just in the private company world, we're thinking of, winners and losers. And when it comes to barley, it is such a niche crop, small acreage, that really we have to be careful and we have to take care of those farmers and our processors in the middle, those maltsters, if we ever want to be able to produce that beer or bourbon that's got US grown ingredients in it. So I do think it's really important to be thinking about that entire supply chain and really tying it back to that because farmers are struggling right now. Farmers are having a hard time. And what I remind my industry members of all the time is there's a lot more easier crops to grow than barley, like corn and soybeans. And because of the genetic improvements in those other crops, they've certainly been able to grow those crops in other areas where we never did 20 years ago. So we have to be really careful and take care with how much we push those farmers because we might lose them as barley farmers. And so honoring that, and I think so many of our member companies really have done a lot of important work honoring the farmers and the folks that are supplying those ingredients to them. So I think as long as that is kind of in the spirit of making that product, that's what's most important.
Yeah. The provenance of all that goes into it and bring that forward would establish the perfect pint, and maybe enjoying it in Washington when you're on a lobby trip and try to convince people. But Ashley, thanks very much for taking some time. It's a wonderful story. Great to hear the successes that you're achieving, and I expect you'll continue to do that. Not easy, but hard work is always the best way to start. So thanks for your time, and we'll definitely follow this up maybe with a separate episode on regen, ag, and
Yeah, that'd be
sustainability.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank
All the
you
best.
again for
Thanks
having
again.
me.
Yeah. All the best. Cheers.
Yep.
I mean, I think, Brent, that's incredible. Just the amount of funding that they've received gone up with how they bringing the farmer to the hill to really bring that whole supply chain story together.
Yeah. Even myself, having spent some time in the US and knowing how that whole system works, we heard a lot about how there was budget cuts and all the
Yep.
things you may hear, myself included, and how difficult it would be to get money. And then Ashley tells us about how they've actually got incremental funding, which I think is a massive victory. So I think it goes to the storytelling, which we mentioned many times, and they're bringing the right, she says, constituents or stakeholders into the picture. So farmers and craft brewers from every state. You can see that that collaboration, which we talk about, is definitely working. So I think credit to Ashley and the whole team and across the stakeholders that they're really delivering that message, and the result is really provable because they're actually getting incremental funding, which is not easy at the moment. So I think that's a major win.
I also liked how she said, you've got to pivot as required. So if things like climate change are not being well received, call it drought and rain, to talk about the symptoms of it, and that is enough to gather you some funding.
Yeah, you have to be nimble, I guess, right, Danielle? So
Exactly.
you have to kind of know your audience. I think she mentions, and that's a perfect way to put it. The fact that there'll be different things that trigger with people, right? So however you can get the message delivered, it needs to change and adapt because the audience, of course, is quite diverse. So like this, I just chalk it up to the proof is in the results, and I guess they've got some really positive results, which I think is, as I say, a major win.
But I do think, Brent, there's definitely a follow-up conversation there. I mean, we spoke a lot in Lisbon about the need to get some alignment in the pre-competitive space on how we measure regen, ag, etc. And I think it sounds like AMBA and Ashley have got the battle scars on how they've done it on their side. So it'd be definitely useful to have a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, and some of it, they've had decades of that collaboration, so that system was really in place. I guess maybe anyone listening to this, maybe they could think in different parts of the world, and there is those efforts going along as well. So it's not just in the U.S., but I think examples like this show that by collaborating in the pre-competitive space, you can actually get some success that's good for the long term. Malting barley and malt supply chain benefit, and everyone's going to still compete at the end of the day, and that's
Yeah,
natural, of course. But I guess finding that place where you can work together is important. And this is one example, just to remind people that it can be done, and really good example here from the U.S.
absolutely. And looking forward, Brent, to next week where we will be pursuing the perfect pint. Which part of the world?
We're going to take a little trip back to Australia to get an update there, and then following that, I was able to capture some really great stories when I was in the UK. So we're in the weeks ahead. You're going to travel from Australia and then back to the UK. So we keep a global view to the pursuit of the perfect pint.
Cheers. See you next week.
Cheers.